So a little bit about Tim. Tim's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, and he's also one of the founding members and architects of our Environmental Sustainability Research Center, and he's played a formative role in that. His specialization is public policy and administration, environmental politics, and research methods. So he wears 3 to 5 hats depending on the day, and a couple of soccer jerseys in between.
That's true. That is also true.
Absolutely true. His main research area is water policy in developed countries, and he's one of the leading experts in understanding the politics of water in irrigation economies. I first became acquainted with some of his work in 2008 through this book, which is one of the co-editors on. And of course, many of you may have had a chance, including the students, to all read his paper on advocacy coalitions in the Alberta Water Act. And so it's been a pleasure having read somebody's work and then getting to know them professionally and personally. And Tim's one of those people, I think, that does work at an intersection of many of our fields. So with that being said, I want to introduce the topic of his talk today, which is ideology and water politics in Southern Alberta. And this is part of a grant which Tim won to catalyze seed funding from our center. So with that said, Tim, thanks so much for being our introductory speaker here today, and I'll pass it over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Ryan. So as Ryan indicated, my talk today serves a number of purposes. One of those purposes is for the students who are here from the Sustainability Science and Society program. This is their transdisciplinary seminar. I still have a problem with that concept, but anyway. So that's, and I think I'm the inaugural seminar in that class. It's actually a class, but we open it up to everybody else. So that's one purpose. Another purpose for this talk is to more or less report on what I did with the money that I won through ESRC and their seed grant competition. It's a second purpose. A third purpose is to more or less report to my colleagues what I did on my sabbatical. You know how when you were a kid, you wrote those essays on what I did on my summer vacation? Well, this is what I did on my sabbatical. At least it's one of the things I did on my sabbatical. And I guess the fourth thing, this is largely chapter 3 of a book that I'm in the middle of writing. A book that seems to be taking forever to finish, but I am making progress, and this is chapter 3, so that's good. I'm encouraged by that. So first of all, thank you very much for coming today. What I plan to do is maybe talk for about 45 minutes and outline some of my latest research, and then I'll open it up to questions, and then I'll stick around. We'll have a break, and then I'll stick around for the SAS students afterwards. So the title of my talk is Ideology and Water Politics in Southern Alberta. And essentially what I did in this project, which is, as I mentioned, part of a larger project on water policy and water politics in Southern Alberta, I devoted a lot of time and energy to actually measuring what people believe when it comes to water policy and water politics in Southern Alberta. And the reason why I did that is because I was working with a theory, one of the fundamental assumptions of which is that what people believe about policy matters. Okay? It matters in the sense that what people believe actually shapes and influences what policy choices are eventually made. So I was looking at policy beliefs, and I was looking at, specifically I was looking at the policy beliefs of so-called policy elites. So interest groups, leaders of interest groups, public servants, politicians, and anybody else who could be considered a policy elite. So just to give you a bit of background on the research problem that I was working on, I've been working on a project on Southern Alberta in various forms for about 5 or 6 years now. And this is the area that I've been focusing on. I don't know if you can see the laser pointer. There you can. So this area here that is blown up, this area of Southern Alberta, is the South Saskatchewan River Basin. And the South Saskatchewan River Basin has 4 sub-basins. It has the Red Deer in the north. It has the Bow that runs through Calgary kind of centrally. It has the Old Man River Basin in the south. And then it has the main stem of the South Saskatchewan sub-basin right there in the southeast. I I came to my interest in water and irrigation in Southern Alberta through a very long and circuitous route. I actually came to it via Australia, where I was doing my dissertation research many years ago, and I came across the irrigation areas, and I was kind of blown away by them because I have a background in agriculture, but I grew up in Southern Ontario, and there's really not any irrigation to speak of in Southern Ontario. But in Australia, farming was a whole different enterprise because they had these massive water delivery systems, and they were planting 2 crops a year instead of 1 as we do here. And I was just really fascinated with all of the irrigation and everything that went with it. And there's a really intense set of water politics that goes along with irrigation in Australia, and how water is allocated, and who gets water and who doesn't get water. So I started looking around in Canada to see whether Canada had much irrigation, and we do. Not as much as Australia, but we do have parts of the country with substantial irrigation areas, and Alberta is the largest of those areas. The other places in Canada that have substantial areas of irrigation are Saskatchewan and the interior of British Columbia. There's also a little bit in southern Manitoba and a little bit in southern Ontario, but nothing to the extent of what exists, for example, in southern Alberta. Southern Alberta is the largest irrigation area in all of Canada. All of the irrigation in southern Alberta, well, not all of it, but just about all of the irrigation in southern Alberta occurs in the South Saskatchewan River Basin, and even within the South Saskatchewan, most of it occurs from about Calgary south. There's a little bit of irrigation up here in the Red Deer Basin. But altogether, in the South Saskatchewan, there is about 1.25 million acres of irrigation. And just about all of the water that is taken and used for irrigation is taken from the surface rivers. So it's taken from the Bow River, the Oldman River, the main stem of the South Saskatchewan, the Red Deer, the St. Mary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the reason why there is irrigation in southern Alberta is because it is a very dry place. It's one of the driest places in Canada. In fact, it has been classified as arid or semi-arid, which means that essentially it's a semi-desert in many places. So without irrigation, in many places in southern Alberta, you simply cannot grow crops, at least reliably. There was actually a large-scale social experiment, unintentional social experiment, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, where the federal government advertised all over Europe to come and farm in sunny southern Alberta, and they used all sorts of propaganda to attract Easterners and Europeans to southern Alberta, and a lot of them set up homesteads, and they were fortunate enough that they set up homesteads in some relatively wet years, but those years didn't last, and by the 1920s there was a massive, massive depopulation of many parts of southern Alberta. One of the responses to that depopulation and to the fact that just agriculture is difficult in southern Alberta was to create what were called irrigation districts. And these are very large tracts of land that have water delivery systems. So basically they have a set of they have a dam or a weir and a set of canals that brings water to the land. And there are 13 of these irrigation districts in southern Alberta, and all of the 13 irrigation districts are in the Bow, the Oldman, or the main stem of the South Saskatchewan. There are no irrigation districts in the Red Deer subbasin. And these irrigation districts are very, very important because they're kind of the water barons of southern Alberta. Well, not kind of, they are the water barons of southern Alberta in the sense that they account for around 80% of water use in the South Saskatchewan. And the irrigation districts hold most of the largest and oldest water entitlements in the basin. The fact that these are the oldest entitlements is important because in southern Alberta, water rights and water licenses have been allocated on the basis of priority. So it's kind of like a first come, first served basis. Okay, so what it means essentially is that the oldest licenses always get their water first. So if you have an 1894 license, you're going to get your water first. If you have an 1895 license, you'll get your water second, and so on and so forth. If it's a dry year and there happens to be a shortage, those with the most recent licenses are simply cut off, or can be cut off. It doesn't happen very often, but it's one of the implications. It's a system called prior allocation, where water is licensed and then it's allocated on the basis of first come, first serve. So what I've been looking at is policy reform in Southern Alberta, and the main policy reforms that have taken place have been since 1995. In 1995, there was a landmark legislative reform. It was called the Water Act, and there was a few reasons why this was a landmark legislative reform. The first reason is that really water legislation in Southern Alberta hadn't been reformed since 1894, at least not significantly reformed. So 101 years later, they actually undertook a significant legislative reform. That's the main reason. The other reason why it was a significant change is that the Water Act signaled a change in approach to water management. So basically from 1894 up to 1995, Alberta, particularly Southern Alberta, was taking a very hard approach to water governance. And it was a hard approach because it focused on water supply and building more and more infrastructure to control more and more of the water supply. In a sense, they knew they were dealing with water scarcity, and their response to water scarcity was to build dams, to build interbasin diversions, to build canal systems, to build storages, and just build. The idea being that they could bring all the water under control and then bring it to where it was needed. 1995 was a shift in the sense that the policy after that became much softer. Okay? In the sense that it's softer in the sense that it's more demand oriented and focuses more on the demand side of the water equation. There were a few significant changes brought about by that legislation. One was the introduction of water license trading, so that irrigation districts and other people who have water licenses in Southern Alberta can now buy and sell them, which was something that they were never allowed to do before. It also introduced something called the conservation holdback, which essentially entitles the Department of the Environment to withhold 10% of the volume of any license that is traded, and then to reallocate that water to environmental flows, to sustain in-stream flows to help fisheries and natural riverine environments and riparian woodlands and things like that. And they introduced other things like water conservation objectives and basin water management planning, and there were a number of other kind of more soft-oriented reforms. The way I characterize it is not a shift from hard to soft, but a shift from hard to softer, in the sense that when they introduced these new kind of soft policy instruments, they didn't abandon the hard ones. They still have their dams, they still have their interbasin diversions and storages and all that stuff, but they took these soft policy instruments and kind of transposed them on top in kind of like a policy sedimentation. It's like a new layer of policy on top of an old layer of policy. So you don't have a displacement, you have sedimentation, you put it that way. Okay? So the problem that I've been looking at in my research is what brought about this shift. If you think about it, this was a pretty big shift, and I mean, I was thinking about it the other day, and I couldn't think of another piece of water legislation that went 101 years without being fundamentally reformed. So when it was actually reformed in 1995, that was a big change, and the question I'm looking at is why? Why then? Why not 20 years earlier? Why not 10 years later? You know, what brought it about? So the theory that I've been looking at to help guide my research and to develop an explanation of this is something called the Advocacy Coalition Framework. And this is the standard diagram of the Advocacy Coalition Framework. And I see a couple of my students here from my graduate seminar in public policy, and tomorrow afternoon we will be discussing this diagram in great depth. For this afternoon, I will not discuss it in great depth. I will just point out the most relevant features of it for the research that I've been doing. The Advocacy Coalition framework derives from the work of two American political scientists, Paul Sabatier and Hank Jenkins Smith. It dates to the late 1980s, early 1990s, and it's now grown to become, it's not the dominant, there isn't really a dominant theory or framework in policy process research, but this is one of the more notable ones. In fact, in the course I teach, I had trouble picking the 9 most prominent because there are more than 9 theories of the policy process. This just happens to be one of them. The feature of this diagram that I want to point out to you is this box on the right-hand side, labeled the policy subsystem, because this is more or less what I'm going to focus on today. So one of the assumptions of the ACF is that policy is made in specialized spheres called policy subsystems. And all policy subsystems have 2 characteristics. They have a geographic boundary and they have a functional boundary. So in my case, the geographic boundary is Southern Alberta and the functional boundary is water and water allocation. So the policy subsystem I'm looking at is the Southern Alberta water policy subsystem. And I would quickly note that there is a distinction between the Southern Alberta water policy subsystem and the Northern Alberta water policy subsystem, where the tar sands are and where they deal with much different interests and they deal with much different water problems. So there's a very different configuration of actors in that subsystem compared to the Southern subsystem that I've been looking at. One of the other fundamental assumptions of the ACF is that policy development is a team sport, in the sense that in developing a policy, you usually have 2 or more teams that are competing with each other. And it's really those teams that I've been investigating. So for example, the teams are called advocacy coalitions, right? And they are coalitions of usually interest group representatives or interest groups, politicians who are interested in that particular issue and have taken up the cause, usually some bureaucrats, often some journalists, some academics, anyone with an interest in the policy subsystem and anyone who takes a position and participates regularly in the policy subsystem. They belong to 1 or more teams. And the main thrust of my research was to try to figure out, what are these teams? What teams or what advocacy coalitions actually exist in this policy subsystem? So even within the policy subsystem, what I've been focusing on mostly are the beliefs and resources of the prevailing coalitions. Those tell me what the coalitions believe in, and they also tell me what coalitions are present. So for example, my research has found that there are 2 coalitions. One is an environmentalist coalition that I've labeled the Greens, and the other is a kind of an irrigation agricultural coalition that I've labeled the Aggies. In other water policy subsystems, for example in California, researchers have found 3 advocacy coalitions. They have found an environmentalist coalition, an irrigation coalition, and an urban industrial coalition. And so one of the unanswered questions was, in Southern Alberta, I was pretty confident that there was an environmentalist coalition. I was pretty confident that there was an Aggie coalition. I was less confident about whether there was an urban coalition or an industrial coalition or maybe even an oil coalition or some coalition combining those 3 altogether. Okay? And one of the pieces of feedback I got on the piece that I published in Canadian Journal of Political Science last year, when I did that work, I looked at these coalitions and what they believed, but all I really did was look at their mandates and mission statements. I didn't go any further than that. And reviewers accepted that as being sufficient, but not great. And I thought, yeah, they're right. I could push this a little further, and I could be a lot more confident in my argument about what coalitions exist and what people believe. Okay? Okay. So, as I said, the aim of my recent research was to find out what people who are involved in developing water policy in Southern Alberta, I wanted to find out what they believed and whether those beliefs actually shaped policy. So the first challenge I had in measuring what people believe or measuring their ideologies was locating data. How do you actually measure what people believe? So I looked at the ACF research, and there were 3 typical approaches for doing this. One was to do a survey, just find survey everybody who might be involved in the policy subsystem, collect the data, and do some kind of analysis about what they believe based on their responses to a survey. The second approach is to use interviews. Much the same thing. Find all the people involved in the policy subsystem, interview them, ask them what they believe, analyze that data. The third way is textual analysis, where you actually find written artifacts where the actors are stating what they believe, and then you systematically analyze that in some way, and in that way you can gauge what they believe. I quickly realized that only one of these 3 approaches would be viable for me, because the period I was looking at was 1971 to 2005. And I was undertaking this research in 2013, 2014, which meant that I couldn't do a survey. If I tried to do interviews, they would be unreliable because people have bad memories, and frankly, some of the people that I needed to talk to were dead, which is not good, or they were scattered across the country, and so I couldn't very well interview them. That left me with textual analysis. So I set about locating documents, and I had a lot more success in finding documents containing expressions of what these actors believe. I had a lot more success finding these documents than I thought. Essentially, what I did was I found public hearings on things like the building of the Old Man Dam, a water basin planning program for the South Saskatchewan. I found public hearings on the Water Act, et cetera, and I found 4 good sources of raw data. I had public hearings from 1978, 1984, 1995, and then the last one was 2002, 2005, because it was one planning program, but they divided it into 2 phases, so for analysis purposes, I consider it as kind of one point in time. And so I made requests to get all of these documents from these public hearings. I had no problem getting the 2002-5 stuff. It came on a CD. The 1995 stuff was fine. It came in a couple of binders. And I requested the 1978 and 1984 stuff, and I didn't know whether I would actually get it, but God bless the University of Alberta Library. They actually sent it. When I went to the Brock Library to pick it up, the lady took my card, scanned it, her eyes went big, and then she said, "Excuse me," and she went back and fetched 3 other people, and they came out pushing carts. So I had my own trolleys full of books. The 1978 hearings alone had 23 volumes of, good-sized books. So be careful what you wish for. I had lots of raw data from that point on. And I had to they wouldn't let me take the trolleys out of the library. I had to walk back and forth. It was a whole thing. All right. So having located all of this raw data, I had to decide, how am I going to analyze this mountain of textual information? And the obvious answer was content analysis. For those of you who are unfamiliar with content analysis is a systematic way of analyzing and sorting textual data sources. Essentially what it is that you create what's called a coding frame, and the coding frame creates categories, and then you sort the text into these various categories through a coding process that I'll describe as we go along. The key thing about content analysis is that if you do it well, it's systematic. In the sense, it's systematic as opposed to just being impressionistic. I could have just sat down and waded through this mountain of textual information, but it would have been just impressionistic, and anything that I would have gotten out of just reading it and then reporting on it wouldn't have been very defensible. So I wanted to do it in a more systematic way. One of the early choices I had to make was whether to do a qualitative or quantitative content analysis. Fairly early in the process, I decided to do a qualitative content analysis for various reasons. I think the chief reason why I did that is because I couldn't abide by one of the key assumptions of quantitative content analysis, which is usually in quantitative analysis, the analysis equates frequency with intensity. So the more often or the more times that a concept or idea is mentioned, it's assumed that the more passionate or intense the source is about that idea. But in the data that I had some submissions from actors that were hundreds of pages long, and I had others that were half a page. So it made no sense to equate frequency with intensity, because frequency was actually related to just how verbose they were, not necessarily how passionate or intense they felt about it. So I opted to do a qualitative content analysis, and what I wanted to do was to create a belief, what I called a belief profile for each actor in each year. So for every actor in 1978, I wanted a concise profile of what their beliefs were that I could see. And by creating all of these belief profiles, I thought then I could analyze them to see if there were kind of ideological groups of actors that shared similar beliefs. So as I mentioned to you, I had this mountain of textual data that I had to somehow sample. There was no way that I could go through and analyze all the data. And in fact, in ACF research, it would have been counterproductive to do that, because one of the assumptions of the ACF is that only those actors or policy elites who participate regularly count. They're the only people who really count as being major influencers of policy. People with a passing or transient interest in a policy area aren't regular participants in a policy subsystem, so their impact on policy is assumed to be lower. And I think that's a fairly safe assumption. So one of the first parameters by the way, the sample that I wanted to create was a purposive sample. It was not a representative sample. So I was not out to kind of get a microcosm of each. I wasn't trying to get a microcosm of the actors involved in each of the years. I was trying to figure out who the important people were in each of the years. And in that way, it was a purposive sample. So in sampling all of this textual data, the first parameter of my purposive sample was repeat participation. So essentially, I took the 4 years of public hearings data I had. I listed all of the participants and all of the organizations that testified in those years, and then I cross-referenced them. And any organization or any individual that showed up twice, they stayed in, and anybody that only showed up once, they were left out of the sample. And that's justified in existing ACF research. Actually, in most ACF research, they require participation 3 times. But since my data points were spread out, I thought requiring 3 points was too much, particularly because the environmentalist movement was kind of late coming to the show, and I didn't want to penalize them. I didn't want to have a bias against them. And there were some challenges in determining repeat participants. For example, some of the organizations decided to change their names. For example, between 1995 and 2002, the Alberta Cattle Commission became the Alberta Beef Producers, so I had to be very cognizant of name changes. That was one of the challenges. And in a lot of ACF research, they only count organizations as participants, but I didn't want to do that. I counted both individuals and organizations, because I said environmentalists were kind of late coming to the game, and I thought that maybe in 1978 and 1984 they might have participated as individuals before the organizations were even formed. So I included both. The second was to remove redundancies. What I mean by redundancies are organizations or individuals that presented more than once in the same year. In 1978, for example, the Alberta Irrigation Projects Association presented 9 briefs in the consultations. I only really needed one, so how to decide which one? I looked for the official one. And if I couldn't find the official one, I took the one from the highest ranking person within that organization. So that's how I dealt with the redundancy issue. And another parameter of the sample was to focus only on submissions. There were, particularly in 1978, they were actual public hearings. So the format was for people to show up at a public hearing, read their submission, and then there would be a question and answer period. In 1984, 1995, and 2002-05, there was no question and answer period. It was just kind of written submissions. So in order to ensure equivalency between the 3 periods, or 4 periods, sorry, in 1978, I ignored the question and answer periods and just focused on the submissions. And eventually I decided that I didn't really need 4 data points. I didn't need all 4 of the years that I found. So I left out the 1984 submissions from the sample. I included the 1984 submissions for the purpose of determining who was an important participant, but I left it out of the actual analysis. So that left me with 3 key points in time, 1978, 1995, and 2002-05, which provides me with 3 nice data points that are well spaced. Each of them represents a chapter later in the book, and they kind of represent a before reform, during reform, and after reform. So that was the logic.
Why did you leave out the 84?
Why would I leave out the 84? I left out the 84 because it was fairly close to 78, and because other than these hearings, there was nothing going on in 1984. I wasn't going to be able to use the 1984 data later on to explain a specific policy because there just wasn't one in 84. So I let it go. It saved me a lot of work. I'd probably still be doing this analysis if I included the 84. Okay, so then it came time, so by this point I've constructed my sample. In other words, I have binders. I have binders of text to analyze rather than carts of information to analyze. So I have a sample, and now I have to come up with a procedure to actually analyze the data and do the content analysis. So one of the first things I had to decide was the coding. I had to decide what would be my coding unit. And in a content analysis, a coding unit is very important because a coding unit is essentially the thing that you're looking for within the data, right? When you're doing a content analysis, you're not looking at all of the textual information. You're kind of searching for the textual information that is most useful to you. And what was most useful to me was what the actors believed about policy and what should be in policy. So I decided to go with a policy recommendation. And this followed an earlier ACF analysis published last year by Liefeld. Another decision to be made in analyzing the data was deciding on a context unit. And while a coding unit is the thing that you're looking for, and a coding unit is also the thing that eventually you will be coding and sorting according to your coding frame, a context unit is kind of the context that you take into consideration when you're coding a coding unit, okay? So because all of the data were coming from public hearings, and they were usually hearings about a report of some sort, whether it was a report on a dam or a report on legislation or something like that, I used that report as context in making coding decisions. The coding unit policy recommendations actually had to be broken down even further into 2 kind of subcomponents, and these represent coding decisions that would have to be made when it actually came time for coding. So I said, basically I defined a policy recommendation as involving both a policy concept and a disposition about that concept, okay? So a policy concept is essentially anything substantive that could be included in water policy. So it could range from anything from build a dam to introduce water license trading to allocate more water to the rivers to, you know, anything. And then the disposition was whether you support, oppose, or are neutral about that concept. Okay, so every time a policy recommendation was isolated and had to be coded, two things had to be coded. The policy concept had to be identified, and then the disposition about that concept also had to be identified and coded. So I had these two elements of policy recommendations. The disposition part is easy. It's easy to code. There's basically four options. You support it, you oppose it, you're neutral, or you're unable to determine, right? So that was easy. So there's really only four coding options when it comes to policy dispositions. Policy concepts are a different matter. There were many policy concepts that could be referenced and actually were referenced in the data. And I had to somehow come up with a list to develop a coding frame to determine different types of policy concepts. So essentially what I did was I read through everything. I read through all of the data once, and while I was doing that, I kept a list. Every time I saw a new policy concept, I noted it in my list. And I kept going and kept going and kept going, and I came up with a list of about 150 policy concepts, and then I started narrowing them down. Ones that were identical or very similar, I tried to fold them into concepts, and I basically, in the end, identified 102 different policy concepts. So whereas there were only 4 options for disposition, there were 102 options when it came to policy concept. So particularly in this part of the coding frame, when it comes to policy concept, that was developed inductively. I went to the data, I searched the data, and then I developed that list and used it to structure my coding frame. One thing I'll mention about policy concepts too, I made a decision early on only to include concepts that were specific. Anything that was vague in general, I left out. So things like sustainability, I left out. Economic growth, I left out. I left all of those things out. The reason I did that is because no one ever opposes sustainability or economic growth or any of these other general concepts. So for example, the Alberta Irrigation Projects Association would submit a policy brief and they would say, yes, we believe in sustainability. Then they would make 50 policy recommendations that would make sustainability impossible, right? So those general policy concepts I more or less left as rhetoric, and I wasn't interested in rhetoric, I was interested in beliefs, and I thought specific concepts would capture that better than general ones. So essentially what I ended up creating was a 2-level coding frame. So when a coder came across a policy recommendation, their first task was to decide, okay, what is the concept in this recommendation? And again, they had 102 choices. And I had a coding guide to help guide the coders, and they made their decisions based on the coding guide. Then once they had identified the appropriate concept, then it was the disposition. And again, they basically had 4 options. So the disposition was the easy part. So with this data analysis procedure established, I proceeded to segmentation. Segmentation is essentially breaking up this textual data into smaller chunks that can then be coded. So at the segmentation stage, I read through the data again and identified all policy recommendations. Everything that I thought could be a policy recommendation, I identified it and put it in square brackets. And I actually went through the binders twice to make sure that, that the identifications were correct, at least as much as I could get them. And in the end, I identified 974 policy recommendations that would then be coded. In the actual coding stage, there were 2 coders. I was one, and Sydney. Sydney, will you raise your hand? Sydney was my intrepid second coder who did a fantastic job. And I used 2 different coders to try to ensure intercoder reliability, to make sure that 2 different people following the same instructions would see roughly the same things in their coding decisions. And in that sense, I'd be more confident that the data were reliable. So we followed the same coding guide. How long was the coding guide? Sydney, was it 10, 12 pages? It had all of those 102 policy concepts and definitions for all of those 102 policy concepts and so on. So I coded and Sydney coded independently. And in the end, we came to 79.6% agreement on our coding decisions, which I was quite happy with. In qualitative research, anything above 75% is considered to be pretty good. And considering that we had 102 options on the one level of the coding frame, I was fairly ecstatic with 79.6%. The remaining 20.4% where we disagreed, Sydney and I basically locked ourselves in a conference room for parts of 4 days, and we went through each of the disagreements and we talked it out with reference to the coding frame, and we would come to some sort of agreement about where it would be most appropriately coded. And if we couldn't come to an agreement, we coded it as unable to determine. In the end, this left us with a single set of observations. So 2 coders created 2 sets of observations. Where we agreed, we just accepted those observations. Where we disagreed, we got together, sorted it out, and produced a single set of observations. And then these observations of beliefs could then be analyzed to determine what actors were believing at different points in time. Before I could actually do that, I had to clean the data, which probably sounds nefarious, but it actually wasn't. For example, in cleaning the data, I removed identical cases. So if the same actor in the same year talked about the same policy concept with the same policy disposition multiple times, that was redundant. We didn't need to see that multiple times in the belief profiles, so I deleted redundant cases. And I also deleted the unable to determines. If we couldn't determine the policy concept or we couldn't determine the policy disposition, that provided no useful information to us on what actors believed, so we cleaned that out as well. Initially, so this left me with a spreadsheet of data about what people believed, and as I said to you, I was interested in trying to determine advocacy coalitions, and so I was really interested in ideological groups or clusters of people who believed roughly the same thing. So I thought maybe I could do a statistical cluster analysis, but I tried to do it for a couple of days and it just kept spitting out garbage, and eventually what I figured out is that I had too much missing data, which I can explain more in the question and answer period if you like. The problem was that this wasn't a survey, so that not every actor responded to every policy concept. Okay, so there were a lot of holes, and it was just the nature of the data. There was nothing I could really do about it. So I couldn't do a statistical cluster analysis. What I did instead was I created tables for each year. And I'll show you one in a minute. So I created a table for 78, for 95, and for 2002-5. And I listed the actors along the x-axis and the beliefs along the y-axis. And I created a chart of what different people believed, and then I started looking for patterns. And essentially what I did was I tested hypotheses about different coalitions. So I looked to see, is there an environmental cluster of beliefs? Is there an agricultural cluster of beliefs? Is there an urban cluster of beliefs? Is there an oil industry cluster of beliefs? And I kept doing that until I came up with, until I thought that I reasonably exercised the data. In doing so, I couldn't create tables with 102 columns. That was a little awkward, and it wouldn't fit in my book. So I ended up folding some of those policy concepts together. So for example, in my coding frame, I had different policy concepts for allocate more water for irrigation, expand irrigation acreage, expand irrigation in general, give more money to irrigation, and I aggregated those into expand irrigation, right? So where I could put them together, I did. I didn't put anything together that didn't co-vary in the observation, so I didn't lose any of that, any of the nuance in the data. So if I can call it up, I'll show you one of the tables that I produced. So this is the table that I developed for 1995. Y means yes and N means no. And you can see, so the policy concepts are across the top. You can kind of ignore the ideological fault lines. That's a grouping of different policy concepts. But you can see how the data shows different clusters of green and aggy beliefs. So for example, on the concept of providing more environmental water, you know, there's a cluster of environmentalist beliefs, and then the Aggies have nothing to say about that. And on preserve the status quo prioritization, in other words, what that means is preserve existing licenses. All the Aggies say yes, and all the Greens say no. And one of the interesting things I found was when it came to market instruments, the Aggies were okay with water license trading, buying and selling water licenses, but they were adamantly opposed to water pricing, which means paying more for the water that's delivered to them. Whereas the Greens were the mirror image. They were very suspicious of water license trading, but they were okay with water pricing, charging the irrigators more. So there were lots of interesting results, and I'm fairly confident in the clusters that I found. The table actually goes on. And as always, there were some that were indeterminate in the sense that they didn't fit either Aggie or Green beliefs, but they didn't constitute a coalition on their own with anybody else. So sometimes they're confused, and sometimes they are groups that I know are Green, but just either didn't express themselves well or for some reason it didn't show up. So I have tables for 1978, for 1995, and for 2002-5, and essentially what they show is this consistently, that there was a cluster of Greens and there was a cluster of Aggies. The cluster of Greens grows over time. It's fairly small in 1978 and gets a little bit bigger every year. And the cluster of Aggies is fairly consistent. It's fairly consistent. It doesn't really grow or shrink much at all. So basically, after all this work, what it confirmed was what I suspected all along. I just now have data to prove it. I better go back to the slide. It confirmed what I suspected all along in the sense that I suspected there were Greens and Aggies and that there wasn't an urban coalition or an industrial coalition, and the data show that. As near as I can figure, the reason why there isn't an urban coalition in particular is that Calgary itself, who would probably be the leader of this coalition, has a very large, very old water entitlement. So they don't feel water insecure, and they don't feel the need to be very active participants in water policy development processes, because as long as they have their license, it's all good for them. They're happy. And the reason why there's not really an oil coalition, as far as I can tell, is that most of the oil reserves in Southern Alberta are pretty well tapped out. They've been on the downward swing since the 1970s. And B, conventional oil extraction is not very water intensive. It's not like unconventional extraction in the north that takes a lot of water. I also found some preliminary evidence of what's called policy learning over time in both coalitions. For example, I mentioned that in 1995, the environmentalists were dead set against water license trading. By 2002, 2005, many of them had come around to the idea of water license trading. And I think a lot of that has to do with its connection to the conservation holdback, taking back water when it's traded. So.